Maxine. Your agent tells us you're quite a popular name in adult film and entertainment. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, did you always want to be in that line of work?
I always wanted to be famous.
So, if you don't mind me asking, why come here and do this?
Well, I've always had a larger vision for myself. Realistically, porn can only take me so far. I'm gonna be 33 years old pretty soon, and in hardcore, women age like bread, not wine. I'm not where I want to be yet. I want the good life.
Ty West, welcome to the program. So we met this character first in X. We had the prequel in Pearl. Introduce me to the world that we're in Maxine.
Well, this is an evolution of the character because we find her in Hollywood, which is sort of where she hoped to always be from the beginning. But now that she's actually there, it's not all it was cracked up to be. And she's kind of hit the ceiling of how far she thinks she can go in one genre of filmmaking, and she's trying to transition into another. And that's kind of when we catch up to her.
There's a great sense of the feeling of the time. As somebody who started watching movies in the 70s and absolutely loved watching movies in the 1980s, I'm seeing a lot of sort of nods to films that I loved. There's a bit of cruising in there. There's some of Dario Argento's gloves. There's a kind of glow to it. Tell me about getting the feel of that period right.
Yeah, that was a big part of, all three movies, was to kind of, one of the connective tissues throughout the trilogy was how cinema of the time is affecting the characters. And so to set it in the 80s, it was no different in the sense that I was trying to recreate an era and represent an authenticity to that. But I was also trying to represent, kind of what media and what films of the time felt like. And so as horror movies are concerned, because it was a sort of a whodunit kind of noirish story, having elements of giallo and this sort of neo-noir feel, I just love all that stuff. And so it was a way to not repeat ourselves and to tell a different kind of story within the same franchise, as if it, people like to call it.
It feels like in each of the three movies, you've kind of stretched the envelope a little bit further, and particularly in terms of the development of the central character. Did you feel like each time it was, let's push it a little bit further and expand the world?
I certainly felt it on this one. I mean, the first two were contained stories, and we made them back to back. Aesthetically, with Pearl, I knew we were taking a pretty big swing, but going in a sort of Technicolor style direction. And I wanted to try to match that in the third movie. And one way to do that was with the scope of the movie, is to leave the farm from the first two films and leave it like way behind and go into a big metropolitan area. So it was very ambitious to do that, but that was certainly on purpose.
Do you have an audience in mind? I mean, I used to write for Fangoria magazine, and there's a moment in the film in which we see a front cover of Fangoria. So, okay, the horror crowd are obviously on board, but do you have a wider audience in mind?
Yeah, with this movie, I mean, with all three movies, I feel like in general, people, there's a lot of people out there that say, oh, I don't watch horror movies, and they have the stigma against it. And then if you say to them, well, what about The Exorcist, or what about The Shining, what about Rosemary's Baby? They say, no, not those. Those ones are fine. But horror movies in general. And then you start to list more movies and you realize people like more horror movies than they think that they do. They've just seen a couple that they didn't think were good or were too violent or too whatever, and then they've kind of put it all in a box, which is really on brand for what this story that I'm telling in the third movie is about. But, I think a lot of times people think that they won't like a movie, and if they give it a chance, they will. And with this trilogy, each movie is very different. So if X is a little too much for you, maybe Pearl isn't. And if Pearl is, too weird for you, maybe Maxine isn't. And that's kind of the fun of it. But I don't think you need to be a horror fan. You'll know when to close your eyes if you're going to be afraid of violence. You see it coming, and so I think that if you're just a fan of movies in general, this trilogy is very like cinema focused, and I think there's a lot to be had there. That's not just the scariness, for lack of a better term.
There's a scene in it in which our central character has to have a face mold made in order so that a prosthetic can be built. And obviously, if you've seen the previous films, you kind of already know that this will have happened. And it becomes a horror scene because the idea of having your entire face enclosed. I remember when I was a kid seeing a picture of Linda Blair being made up by Dick Smith and the straw so she could breathe. That whole thing about the the background of the process of making a film is something you seem to really relish in this. You really like taking the audience behind the curtain and going, okay, well, you love your monster and the rest of it. This is how it's actually made. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a big part of making this trilogy and even starting with X was to really focus on like the craft of filmmaking. And so with X, to have it be a story about characters making a movie within a movie, particularly a movie that's meant to be like erotic when you see it, but when you see how they make it, it's completely clumsy and ridiculous. That's a way to kind of let the audience in and see behind the curtain. But the character's still trying to make a good movie. And so when you start to see that and you relate to that, then maybe you have a little bit more perspective on what I'm trying to do in the film. And so to take that into Maxine is for people who like horror movies or people who like movies that are made and the sort of magic of the movies and things like that, to kind of let you see how it's done and then to try to have a new perspective on that, to try to make a stylistic, scary sequence out of a behind the scenes process of making films. And so, and then Mia also, she went through a lot of that in making X because we had to, do life cast her and everything for that. So there's kind of a fun, almost meta nature to the three movies and how they relate to one another.